Paul's been recognised by several awards, including ACM SIGGRAPH's first significant new researcher award in 2011, and he's also an Academy Award winner in the Science and Engineering Academy Awards in 2010, as well as many other recognitions as well. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Paul to give the presentation, Light Fields and Light Stages for Photoreal Movies, Games and Virtual Reality.
Thank you very much. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Andrew. And I couldn't imagine a more exciting conference to be here. I hope you enjoyed this talk. I can guarantee if you stay around for afterwards, there is a superstar, amazing session of other people's who will be speaking about various kinds of light field things right after the break. So please stay around for the afternoon sessions if you're interested in any of these topics. Let's see here. Currently, as Andrew mentioned, still working at the University of Southern California as an adjunct research professor through the USC Institute for Creative Technologies. And this was basically my first job I got after graduating from UC Berkeley. They've been working since the year 2000 to try to create the next generation of virtual reality. And I think as of the last couple of years, we got there, so mission accomplished on some of that. There I get to work with some amazing colleagues like Jerne Barbich and Hao Li, who's now the head of the Vision and Graphics Laboratory, as well as Ari Shapiro, who's an amazing researcher over there. Warning, if you work near our lab, we might scan you in one of the light stages and turn you into a digital version of yourself, and just be careful when you sign the release forms for that. The other place that I tend to work now as my main job is at Google. I still work out of an office in Playa Vista, and the things that's so exciting for me about this is that I get to work with some of the same great people that I worked with at the USC Institute for Creative Technologies. A lot of new people who are visionaries of the computer graphics field. One of the presenters coming up this afternoon will be Kurt Akeley, who came from Silicon Graphics and Lytro, and he joined Google recently. I can't wait to hear what he has to say. And other folks such as Mark Lavoie and Steve Seitz, and Noah Snavely, who are really inspirational. And there's also really inspirational products that come out of Google, things like VR headsets, the very nice cameras that are in the back of the Pixel phones, and various virtual reality recording devices, cameras like the GoPro Odyssey there. That's a ring of synchronized GoPros for omnidirectional stereo. The more recent one that we have is the Yi Halo, which is these Yi 4K cameras, and the one that looks up is actually hidden inside sort of a little bit of a kind of a salad bowl construction looking up here so that it gets these rays that are about aligned as close as you can with what the other cameras are doing. And what I really like is that we're transitioning to headsets that are totally mobile, but also have 6-degree of freedom tracking. So if you went to Mark Bolas's talk, you saw some of those nice Windows mixed reality setups that have 2 cameras in front, and you can actually get your positional tracking so it can adjust the point of view of your CG scene as you move your head. A collaboration that Google had with Lenovo created a totally wireless headset that has this, and it actually comes paired with a nice little pocket camera that's called a VR 180 camera. It has 2 fisheye lenses that are interocular apart, and you can shoot a stereo 180 image, put it directly into the headset, and then feel, if you kind of keep your head still at least, like you're back in that place that you took the photograph. And that's really neat. The problem, or the mismatch a little bit, is that now that we have these headsets with positional tracking, our VR recording devices don't give you photographic experiences that let you take advantage of the positional tracking and kind of keeps you stuck in the same position even when you move your head. And it's been noted that that can cause a mismatch between how you think the world should be responding to your head motion and how it actually is responding. And I think that's one of the significant causes of some discomfort people can get in VR when they're watching virtual reality video. So we have been thinking for a while about how to solve that, and it turns out light fields is one way to go about that. And I'd like to show a slide that I had at a talk that I gave at Stanford. And I'd like to credit Joyce Farrell, who organizes an amazing symposium at Stanford called the Cyan Workshops. And she put one together in early 2015 in the heat of the fervor of virtual reality springing back to life. And it wasn't technically on VR, but it was on light field imaging. So she put a whole day symposium together on light field imaging. And it just felt wrong to show up to this symposium to talk about light fields if you didn't also somehow hook VR into it in some way. So that inspired me and some members of my team think about, well, if we wanted to put light fields into VR, what kind of camera system should we build for that? And we put this slide specifically to have something nice for the end of the talk that we'd show to Joyce later. The idea was, let's have a ball of cameras and try to capture all of the rays of light coming into a volume of space so that then in VR, as you move your head around, you have all of those rays of light recorded, and through light field imaging, you can generate the perspectives photorealistically of what you really want. This was a bunch of GoPros, and we weren't too keen on having to take the little micro SD cards out of 126 GoPros or necessarily deal with all of that, all of that data. So we ended up looking first in our work at Google at recording light field stills, and with fewer cameras, but kind of moving them around. And that became a project that we actually released last year called Welcome to Light Fields. And it's some work that I did collaboratively with a number of people at Google, but principally Ryan Overbeck, Daniel Erickson, and Dan Evangelikos. They're up in the San Francisco office here. And what you're seeing here in the background are, they look like kind of smooth camera pans over some interesting scenes that have nice geometry and reflections and such, and hopefully they look pretty realistic. These are all actually synthetic camera motion generated from light field still photographs. So after the fact, we could actually fly a camera around in any possible camera path that you would want to see. So light fields have been around for a while. We saw some of the early references to them in Mark Bolas's talk. They really hit the scene in computer graphics with a pair of papers at SIGGRAPH 96 from Lavoie and Hanrahan, and then Microsoft Research as well with the light field rendering and the Lumigraph. They've sort of sprung to life in virtual reality as well recently with efforts from Otoy, which I got to help out with a little bit, and also Lytro, which we'll hear more about from Kurt Akeley. Our goal that differentiated us a little bit from some of the other projects is that we wanted to have a pretty quick and efficient way to shoot these light field stills, and ideally, not too expensive. The idea that we had was, let's just basically take one of those GoPro omnidirectional stereo rigs, which was no trouble for us to get a hold of, and then kind of pull the cameras off, use that nice synchronization method that Tim McMillan and colleagues over at GoPro figured out how to do, and then stretch them out into a kind of a larger arc and then put them on a motorized turntable. So in about 30 seconds, it'll rotate around and capture that full sphere of incident rays. And this is me and the co-authors of that paper, not technically needing 4 people to do this, but taking it out of a suitcase, putting it on a tripod, and then getting it ready for a scan in under 10 minutes. So if you take a long exposure photo with the little power lights on, you get a kind of a indication of of where all the cameras are. There's actually an interesting little drop string mechanism so that you can make it so that as it rotates around, a string is unwinding that slowly lowers it down so that after one rotation, it's dropped half a camera position. And then on the second rotation, it'll interleave another 16 rows. And so for stuff that's closer to camera that you want more views of, you can get a 32-row light field instead of a 16-row light field if you run it twice. And then the basic idea of light field rendering here is that we have photographed the rays of light at this surface here, and sample them as well we can with cameras that are as close together as we can. And now we want to generate the rays of light that create the images that you might need to see somewhere inside this volume where we never put the cameras. And the observation from light field rendering is that the rays of light that you need to generate the image here were recorded by the cameras that were placed out here. Just different parts of this image are going to need to pull in from different pixels of different cameras. And a little bit of view interpolation techniques like projecting onto depth maps and slightly re-rendering the views is able to generate the rays that would have come from in between the cameras as well. And so you can generate from this same set of images the view you'd see for this headset right here, the view that you'd see for a different position that you can move to, and certainly for the two different eyes. And if you do it efficiently, you can do it at 90 frames per second and high resolution and run it in your Vive or your Rift. So once we had this technology working, we had to think of some nice places to record. And some people contacted us, our friends from the Smithsonian Institution, and asked, they said they were doing a documentation of Space Shuttle discovery at the Udvar-Hazy Air and Space Museum in Virginia. And they asked us if we would like to come help them document it by shooting light fields in there. And of course the answer to that question is yes, because we got to go over there with our light field rig and put it on the flight deck of the world's most launched spaceship, and record some of the appearance of actually getting to be there. And certainly one thing that makes a nice light field is sort of a privileged location that you'd really like to go to, but not that many people get to go to. And to be in the flight deck of a space shuttle that's actually flown is one of those special things. So once we get all those images recorded, we have pretty accurate motors and placement, but we still run it through a calibration process to, through computer vision techniques, look at all the little feature points we can detect and do a bundle adjustment and figure out exactly where all the cameras really were. And then the next part, this actually goes pretty quickly from here, is that we need to render views that are seen from novel points of view. And as I mentioned before, the way that these views actually get created is that you see tons of ellipses here, because the pixels in each one of these ellipses corresponds to the rays that we're grabbing from the individual cameras that we have after the calibration process. And you can kind of see the space shuttle there. We're actually moving around in a circular arc, looking around. We're translating the viewpoint. And what happens is that different parts of the space shuttle flight deck will peer through different ellipses as we move around. You'll see that the ellipses are kind of closer to you than the surfaces that you've got out there. And so it's actually going to be transitioning between different images, playing the role of the pixels for each part of the scene. So even things like reflections are going to come out well. Like if there's a shiny screen, you'll see the reflection shifting around as you move back and forth, because the different views from the different cameras are getting used. Now, this looks funny because it's just made out of ellipses, but if we make those ellipses just a little bit bigger and then blend between them, it creates images that ideally look much closer to just being there in the scene and moving around. So that's about the amount of head motion that we can get. We actually took into account the distance between the commander and pilot seats of the space shuttle when we designed the rig, so that we could move it around in there. Got about 7 light fields total, and you can kind of get a little mini tour of the space shuttle through that. So hopefully it looks pretty realistic. We didn't think we were exploring all the great things photography can do very well if we didn't take any pictures of people. And even though our rig isn't instantaneous, if you're willing to sit still for 20 seconds or so while the cameras swing by, you can actually take pictures of people. And we found this lovely couple of artists, Sherry and Gonzalo, who've been decorating their house in Venice, California with all sorts of ceramics and crushed pottery and little bits of mirror and such. So their house itself looked like a great light field. And then, we got to thinking, well, they're just gorgeous too. We should get a light field of them. So they were up for posing for a light field portrait in their own front porch. And there was the problem of like, well, where do we tell them to look? Because normally you say, oh, okay, look at the camera, we'll take your picture. And there's lots of cameras and they're moving. So the first thought was to have them kind of look at this little pink tape here right in the middle of the rig, and we'd get a light field. And if you look at that, they're kind of just sort of staring straight into space kind of blankly. And it's a little odd for that. So we took another light field where we had them look at the green tape. So they're actually following the rig with their eyes as it goes around. So at least if you're kind of even with them vertically, no matter where you go, they're always looking back at you, which brings them to life a little bit more. It's still creepy, don't get me wrong about that, but it seems to be, probably of the two, maybe the better way to do it. So if you take a look here, you might be able to see that their eyes kind of follow you a little bit. And if anyone went to Ms. Benoit's hologram demos at the demo session last night, she actually had a hologram that was shot like decades ago, and somehow the way they'd shot the hologram had that same kind of effect. So there is this nice tie-in between light fields and holograms that you can see. We actually realized that another form of portraiture is self-portraiture, and we found by putting a mirror into the scene, we can have the light field rig take a self-portrait as well. So here we are in an Airstream trailer outside the Google building in Venice. And as we actually render views going back and forth, the light field rig actually animates itself because it's pulling rays from the cameras that shot along the same ray that you're looking. So if you move over here, it has to grab rays that were shot from over there. That means the cameras are over there now. So if you ever see this light field yourself, you can actually move around and then animate the rig back and forth as you go. And another favorite light field that we got was just this stained glass window, which is a very two-dimensional thing, except that the sun's coming through it. So as you move back and forth, you can actually sort of decide which pane of glass the sun will shine through, and you can get kind of a more realistic effect than you get in traditional virtual reality. So I'm very happy to say that if you want to see any of these yourself, there is a application called Welcome to Light Fields on the Steam store. And if you have an HTC Vive or an Oculus Rift or a Windows mixed reality, and you get Steam running, then you can download it for free, and you can experience about 35 different light fields, including the tour of the space shuttle, the Gamble House in Pasadena, and the Tile House that you'll see in a couple bonus light fields. And we have been continuing to get to work on some of this stuff. We've been dabbling in light field video. This is some light field video of a fountain over at Loyola Marymount University near us. And you can see this is Matt Whalen on our camera team, who used to work with Tim McMillan over at GoPro, and we're very happy to work with him now. And he's got this array of 32 GoPros kind of in a little hexagonal arrangement that we have, and so we can shoot some light field video in a pretty portable and not too expensive way. So that's one of the really fun things that you can do if you have a lot of cameras. The other side of the work that I've done some things in over the years is looking at the problem of what can you do when you have a lot of light sources. And you know, cameras and light sources are kind of duals of each other, so why not think about that? And that basically has been the motivation of a lot of work that we've done in the light stages. Probably my favorite early light stage that we built was back in the early 2000s. It was light stage 3, and it was a geodesic sphere with 156 color LED light sources from Color Kinetics on it. And with a USB interface over DMX, you could drive anyone to be any RGB color pretty efficiently. And so I had been shooting all of these high dynamic range panoramas called HDRI maps or light probe images that try to get the correct color and intensity of light everywhere in the scene. You can use them to illuminate a CGI object if you're doing visual effects with a renderer like Radiance or Arnold or V-Ray. And we thought, well, why not use these recordings of light in the real world and let's light real people up with it. And so if you have this omnidirectional image, you can resample it onto the light sources. You want to make sure you don't clip anything and keep everything linear. And then you can actually have your friends stand in the light stage and then light them with the light of the UC Berkeley Eucalyptus Grove or the Uffizi Gallery in Florence or the light of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. And then if you composite them in to a background from there, it should, in theory, look like a photo of them just standing in that environment because they're lit the right way and they're consistent with the light that you see in the background. A little bit of a trick you need to do, try to get the alpha matte, the composite into the background. And the normal way to do that would be green screen, but we were trying to be purists about this and not throw extra green light on the people. So we did this with a black cloth that reflected infrared light, and we did a beam splitter here with an infrared sensitive monochrome camera and then a color camera. And so we get these two views simultaneously. In infrared, they're just kind of lit from the back with, silhouetted, and that gives you your alpha channel without using a green screen, and then you can composite in based on the color image. And we showed this at SIGGRAPH 2001 and 2002, and it took a while for there to be like a particularly good application for this in the film industry. There was a little bit of a use of it in the movie The Social Network to make kind of a composite of the Winklevoss twins when only one had been filmed on set. But the place where it got used quite a bit was the film Gravity that came out in 2013. And this starred George Clooney and Sandra Bullock. And obviously it had a decent budget, but not enough to send them to space. So they had to figure out a way to shoot these kinds of scenes on Earth. And they did it using a lot of computer graphics, way more computer graphics than you would think watching the film. This is a computer-generated Earth, space telescope. These are computer-generated tools, computer-generated astronaut uniforms, spacesuits, even the visors digital. The only thing that wasn't rendered out of a computer are the faces of the actors, and those are shot in a studio and then composited in. But if you've seen the film, you know that the camera moves around very fluidly, the astronauts are turning, the lighting on them is rotating around all the time, and integrating realistically these faces into these very dynamic scenes with almost perfect lighting reference of these diffuse and specular spheres all around their heads, and having that match is a challenging compositing problem. So they decided to work on a lighting reproduction device. We got to help with them in the R&D parts of the project. And in Pinewood Studios in London, they built a enclosure of LED panels. They pre-rendered all of the CGI scenes of the inside the ISS, floating around the space shuttle, going through space. They pre-rendered those with Arnold, a global illumination program. And they rendered another omnidirectional view from the position of the space helmet. And then that would get played back while the actor was in this little basket and would get spun around in the right things on motion control. So they get the right viewpoint, they get the right lighting. The actors could even kind of see where the things are they were supposed to be reacting to as they floated by. And the result is that they got some quite convincing composites of these actors shot in a studio into otherwise CGI versions. Now they wear a kind of a mock-up of the spacesuit to help motivate their motions, but in the end, it's a totally CGI spacesuit, and they end up keyframe animating even all of the finger motions and such. And there's one scene where Sandra Bullock is basically tumbling out of control, and this huge area of bounce light from the Earth and then the light of the sun are just spinning around almost out of control. And it would have been pretty difficult to match all of that dynamically using other techniques. So here's the pre-visualization of the tumbling. Here's this is Frame Store in London did all this visual effects work. And so here's the composited shot where it's all matching. And you need that to feel like this actor is really in danger. And this has now kind of become a staple of space movies. So let's see here, Rogue One, a Star Wars story, they built mock-ups of the cockpits. This is Industrial Light and Magic. And then you would play back the lighting on that. Also Solo, First Man, and such also use this technology. So we've continued to work with this in the light stages. One thing that always seems slightly problematic to us is that those lights in our first color light stage only had red and green and blue LEDs in them. And we measured them with a spectroradiometer, and we could see there's a big gap between the red and the green LED and the green and the blue LED spectrally. And we also just noticed with our eyes that if you make a color white with RGB LEDs, it'll light a piece of white paper to look like a nice normal white, but then if you put a person in it, they tend to look oversaturated in their color and tinted toward magenta, and that has to do with the way that the spectral reflectance of our skin kind of aliases against the spectral reflectance of the red, green, and blue LEDs, which is why better light sources have white LEDs in them too. And so when we built our latest light stage at USC ICT called Light Stage X3, we actually designed in 6 color channels: red, green, blue, amber, cyan, and white. And we thought we'll get much better color rendition without having to do post-color corrections and such. The film industry people aren't too worried about having to do a little bit of color correction because they have people for that. But wouldn't it be nice if the light stage just got the right answer to within a % or two, right out of the camera without having to do any tweaks? But that caused a question for us, which is how do you drive red, green, and blue, and amber, and cyan, and white light sources when you're shooting your HDRI maps with a camera of like a mirror ball or some panorama and only has red, green, and blue channels? Well, it seemed like maybe we can't use conventional cameras to shoot our lighting anymore. We could go and get our SpectraScan out of the drawer and then just start measuring the whole spectral curve of every single one of those directions and then try to brew our light sources together to match sort of the spectrum that we got everywhere. But that seemed like it would take a long time and the light would probably change by the time you were done. So we thought of the other thing, well, we've got these color checker charts going around, and as we all know, they have a bunch of different color reflectances. And there actually exist techniques, like the one I'm citing down here, that if you have an illuminant hitting that chart, you can get a pretty good estimate of that illuminant just based on looking at the RGB values reflecting off of all of these color chips, right? The math kind of works that you see enough modulations of the spectrum that you can do some linear stuff and figure out what the spectrum was. But then there's the problem, which is that the color chart isn't a terribly focused instrument. You aim it and it gets like a whole hemisphere of light over there. And we kind of want to measure little parts of the environment at a time because we want to drive 331 different light sources coming from different cones of directions. So for that, we realized that if we then had a color chart lit by a certain direction of light, the way that we would drive the light sources in our light stage actually can be done without doing too much crazy mathematics. Let me show you how we move the color chart around first here. This is a little mock-up of what we did. So this is a kind of a pan-tilt unit here, normally for taking panoramas. And out of construction paper, we made a little snoot for our color chart that puts it in the back here. And then there's like a 10-degree opening here with a diffuser. So the color chart that's nestled inside this thing is only lit by 10 degrees of cone of illumination. So if we rotate this around, we can actually get an image spectrally of what all of these light sources are actually doing in different directions. And then if you have a color chart, this is the math here. If we have observations of what the color chart looks like lit by the red LEDs of the stage, the green, the blue, the cyan, the amber, and white, if we then want to match the way that it looked in the real environment, you just have to figure out what linear combination of these color chart images best approximates the way that it looked in the real world. And if you do a non-negative solve for that, it tells you how to drive your 6 channels of light in order to make the color chart look the same as it did in the real world. And we will, for our intents and purposes, say that we've matched the color rendition properties to that particular camera quite nicely at that point. So going back over here, that's still a little bit slow kind of putting the color chart looking in every single direction. So we actually came up with a hybrid technique that shoots high-resolution RGB in every direction using a mirror ball, or maybe 2, so that we see a little bit more dynamic range with a mirror one and a black plastic one. And then a few color charts in different directions. I think you can see parts of Chloe Legendre here, our graduate student, photographing this light probe measurement. And then that can be promoted to spectral information based on these 5 little charts here in different directions. And I think if you look out on the show floor, you might see some of these here because the folks who make them are actually right here at Electronic Imaging. Finally, some results for this particular technique. These are some compositing results where we wanted to take a subject in a real environment, record the lighting there, and then show that we can reproduce that in the light stage without having to do any color correction. So what we do is we ask her to be photographed under the lighting that we're trying to capture. Then we have her step out of the scene. We get just the background plate. And in the light stage, we take a picture of her lit by the reproduction of that light in the light stage on kind of this dark background. And then 1/10 of a second later, we turn off the light stage and flash the background so that we get a matte there. We didn't have the infrared thing, but we could quickly do this for the still photos. And then we'll composite her onto this image using this map, and hopefully they look the same. She might have brushed her hair in between coming upstairs and such like that. But what you can see here is this is a real photo of her actually in the environment. Here she is in the light stage. Here's the light stage with the background, and then just to kind of compare the two, you can see they match pretty well. And then we did this with another friend of ours here. This is Janetta. She's in shade. There's the real photo. There she is in the light stage. You can see some of the sky synthetically reflecting off of her forehead there. And there's the composite. And then there's the comparison there too. So we were happy. We're getting accurate enough results to within 1 or 2% with the 6 channels of light. And if you only need 2%, you can do it with just red, green, blue, and W. So that technique is starting to get some use in actual production. The technique that our light stages get used for actually the most is for facial scanning. It's getting high-resolution 3D models of people's faces. And the lighting patterns that we use for that use just white LEDs from everywhere. But we actually put polarizers on all the LEDs and a polarizer on the camera. And by switching the polarization states, we can get the specular reflection of the skin to either cancel out or come back. And this is going to enable us to get good diffuse texture maps for the skin, good specular texture maps for the skin. And if we kind of move the light into different kind of blurry directions, we're basically lighting people with the first 4 spherical harmonics, we can get a nice surface orientation map for the face based on either the diffuse or the specular reflection. And that's going to let us get very high-resolution facial scans. So if we take a look here, this is the set of lighting conditions that we shoot in about 2 seconds of cross-polarized images with no specular reflection, parallel polarized images where the specular reflection comes in, and then we either shoot from multiple cameras or use some structured light to get a basic 3D model of the face. If you look at these a little closer, you can see this is a cross-polarized out diffuse image. You don't even see the reflections of the light sources in the eyes because we've gotten rid of all the speculars. If we flip the polarization, the specular reflection comes back in. You can now see the reflections in the eyes, and also the luster of the skin comes back. And then if you take the difference between those 2 images, called polarization difference imaging, you get just the specular reflection of the face lit by the whole sphere of light at the same time, just as the difference of these 2 photos. And that's really useful for making the shading maps for your digital character. If you then also look at it not just under full-on light, but light from the right, light from above, light from the front, these 4 images and a tiny bit of math will actually give you a surface orientation map of the face, because it'll tell you in those 4 pixel values you get which part of the light stage is reflecting in that pixel toward the camera. And based on that, you've got a reflection vector. You can turn that into a surface normal. This is using the red, green, and blue channels of this image to show the red, green, and blue, the X, Y, and Z components of the surface normal. And if you use that as your high-resolution detail on your facial scan, you can get scans that are accurate to about 0.1 millimeters of accuracy. And this is how we started getting facial scans that when we worked with visual effects companies that can do animation like Image Metrics, 10 years ago, we were able to collaboratively produce this animation of actress Emily O'Brien with a complete facial replacement and looking pretty realistic for a digital face for 10 years ago. There's the diffuse component. There's the specular component, looks a little crazy, but it has all those crinkles and wrinkles and things that help make us look more emotive. And then there's the wireframe mesh, and then that's the original video before we replaced her face that we were trying to match to, which came out pretty well. Nowadays, we actually also get in the light stage with a camera inside, taking macro photos of just little tiny patches of skin to get hundredth of a millimeter detail of the skin microgeometry. And then with some texture synthesis techniques, we can make our scans accurate to, well, simulated up to hundredth of a millimeter or 10 micron scan. So you can get close to our digital characters this close and see their skin texture. And we've even done some work with Koki Nagano, our graduate student, to simulate the dynamics of skin microgeometry, showing the little stretchings that those microgeometry things have that show the tension in the skin as you go through animation. So we've been very happy that some of our friends in the movie industry have been able to use some of this technology. The first movie that actually used these high-resolution polarized gradient illumination scans was Avatar. And our friends at Weta Digital brought over Zoe Saldana and Sam Worthington, Sigourney Weaver, to get high-resolution scans of their faces so that we could help turn them into, or so that Weta could turn them into the Na'vi versions of their characters, the residents of Pandora. And if you look at Neytiri's face here, you'll see she looks a little bit like Zoe Saldana. And in fact, literally, what's happened is that everything from the cheekbones down is basically scans of Zoe's face and some of her forehead textures as well, and then they change her eyes a lot because, you know, she's from Pandora and such. This scene was pretty interesting because Neytiri leans down to kiss Sam Worthington's character, Jake Sully. And in this shot, everything's digital too. That's actually a completely digital Sam Worthington. And while he's certainly being paid enough to lay down in front of a green screen and have them move the camera around to get a real element of that, to get that lighting interaction between the two faces, the shadowing, the subtle blue reflections in his face of her skin reflecting on his, is a lot easier if they're just all in the same CGI scene and basically can be rendered with computer graphics all together. So I gave a talk at the Smithsonian Institution in 2013, and I mentioned some of this work. And they have some amazing people at their digitization program office who have been going around the world scanning all sorts of exciting things. And after that talk, they got in touch with me because they had another project to do a 3D documentation that they were trying to figure out, which was, as they said, to do a VIP person on the East Coast. And they wondered, is there any way to bring our light stage over to where they are? And without really knowing how to do that, I said, well, yes, of course, we'll do that. And then when the project got real, we had a very active 4 days in our lab, kind of building a foldable, travelable structure, and then pulling off equipment from our light stage in the lab, which is just to the left over here. We brought 50 light sources over, all 8 of our Canon 1DX cameras, 6 Canon Rebel cameras, and designed this so it could fold up and go into a crate. It could possibly open up and go through a single doorway. And then we got it out there. And then in June of 2014, we went through all proper procedures of hiring a truck and then taking it to where it needed to go and just kind of backing it up to the front door there. And after a day of testing, the big day was noon. The next day, we did a test of it, seemed to work. And then our VIP showed up, and we got to do a facial scan of President Obama here. I was happy that one of our graduate students, Paul Graham, was in the Air Force and definitely made us look like more of a professional operation. There's our scan. Those are our polarized gradient illumination conditions going off there. We got 3 scans of him, 2 in kind of the presidential pose, and then 1 of that nice smile that he can do when he's got a photograph to take. These are the lighting conditions we got from the center camera, and we'll do like a rough stereo solve from the 8 cameras, and then we'll get that high resolution detail from the surface normals from the polarized gradients. And we didn't have that long to work with the data, but within a couple of days, we had a model that we'd solved for that had pretty high resolution detail. And I think for summer of 2014, this probably was the best, highest resolution way to scan a face that was available at the time. And this data and this model are now in the collection of the National Archives. And for the White House Maker Faire, they also took the data and they used it. They didn't have any of the texture map information, but to actually do a 3D print that was accurate to about 1/10 of a millimeter of the subject as well. And then the hope is that he warms up to it at some point and decides there. So he seemed to be okay with that. So the most recent project that did something I thought was pretty cool with the technology was the film Blade Runner 2049. It won last year's Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. And we actually scanned 4 actors for the film. They were these 2 actresses here, Ana de Armas and Mackenzie Davis, who have a scene where they kind of blend into each other. And to try to make that blending of the 2 people be kind of, you know, instead of just Z-thrashing, kind of doing a morph, they actually got high-res scans of both of them and created an intermediate version that they could kind of blend into as they do the scene. And that came out pretty well. But kind of the more, you know, notable effect they wanted to do is that they wanted the character of Rachel, played by Sean Young from the 1982 film, to show up in the film the way that she looked back in 1982. And so this is challenging because none of us look the way that we did in 1982. Sean Young was fortunately available, but they also brought in an actress named Lauren Pita here. And the idea was to try to transform her into someone who looked like Sean Young playing Rachel. So Lauren Pita was chosen because she's a very good actress, has a passing resemblance to Rachel, but she could wear the makeup and she could be basically the texture map, the reference for the face. So they put her into Rachel makeup. This is Chloe Legendre here taking some of the skin microgeometry measurements of her. We did scans of her entire face. And then Sean Young as well came and got scanned. She was absolutely lovely. The data for all of this went to MPC, Amazing Visual Effects Company, which kind of used the bone structure that you could see from the scans for Sean Young, and then the reflectance properties that you get from Lauren Pita, and then a lot of work afterwards, and some amazing animation that a friend of mine, Habib Zargapur, helped supervise, and they were able to create this scene. So this is a little bit of making of. It's going to look a little macabre for a second here with the bone structure showing. But then it is a total head replacement down to, you know, the eyes and the hair. The little flyaway hairs were very important that you can see sticking out. And for me, it was like a 1.5 year wait from when we did the scans to when the movie came out. And so I was, you know, really anticipating the scene. And when the shot came on, I'm totally trying to see, oh, okay, does the lighting look good? Does the skin reflectance look good? Is the subsurface scattering doing the right thing? And they had animated the face so well, and the scene is like an important part of the movie that, you know, after 10 seconds of me trying to deconstruct it, I was actually just pulled right back into the movie and the performance. So that was a successful thing. So those are things you can do if you have a lot of light sources. I guess a light source isn't technically the dual of a camera. I guess a light source would be the dual of like a light sensor. And a camera actually has lots of pixels. Now there are some light sources that have lots of pixels, and those are video projectors. So you could then ask, well, what can you do if you have a lot of video projectors, right? And so we think about this too. And this is one of our things where we were trying to think of a variety of impractical ways to make 4D light field displays. Let's just buy tons of little pico projectors and put them really far away so that they become little bits of your angular view, and then maybe you could create a light field display out of a lot of video projectors. You know, probably the thing that's, no matter what else we've done, still is our favorite display is the one that I got to work on with the great Mark Bolas and Ian McDowell. Back in 2007 at ICT, that used this high-speed video projection onto a spinning anisotropic display surface. And you saw this in Mark Bolas's talk. And you know, really the big fun here is you can get a whole group of friends around at 360, and you can see your friend looking at the display, almost seeing that image reflecting in their expression on their face coming across from you. So it kind of becomes a more shared group experience. And we were always, of course, interested in scaling this up. How would you show a full body of someone? And you know, the design does theoretically scale up. We actually worked with a Hydrospace group, an aerospace engineering company. And we have a design that has a 2-meter tall spinning anisotropic reflector. It's kind of like spinning the front door of your house at 900 RPM. It was suggested that we might want to enclose this. And also that you might want to evacuate it as well so that you're not creating a very, very big fan. And this theoretically could work. You get like a big, bright Christie projector, hot wired to do 20,000 frames per second, showing the right points of view, and you could reflect it out everywhere. And we even went so far as to kind of prototype it out in low speed by putting some lenticular stuff there, the wrong way so that it gives the anisotropic reflections. Our friends at Digital Domain heard about this, and they kind of mocked up an idea to do a museum exhibit at the Met that would like show some famous fashion photography holographically 360 all the way around. And then somehow around the same time, there was this episode of Silicon Valley that came on that I still don't know quite what the connection is, but this is what it looked like. And they actually showed one of the main characters of the show kind of holographically
Hello, Nelson.
Visiting.
Thanks for meeting with me.
Whoa. Hi, that's cool. Am I a hologram over there, too?
What? No, of course not. Question. Do you still talk to Richard Hendricks?
Yeah. I mean, not about Nucleus or anything.
Why would he enter Pied Piper and TechCrunch?
So I'm getting a little short on time, so I won't show you the whole thing. But if you've seen the episode, you know that things end up going horribly wrong with the device shortly after this. So that kind of validated this might not be the best idea unless you really know what you're doing. So when it did come time to build a full-scale, like life-size display, we did it using the video projector array technique. And we kind of found a little video projector that was pretty narrow and high enough resolution and pretty good color, and then got a lot of this kind of anisotropic rear projection material that spreads light 60 degrees vertically and about 1 degree horizontally. That's enough to blur between the video projector lenses. This is one of our friends, science correspondent Cara Santa Maria, who got recorded from a whole array of cameras to project onto the display. And the most important work we did with this was actually with USC Shoah Foundation Institute and ICT's Natural Language Group to record testimony of survivors of the World War II Holocaust. And so they actually sat with inside Light Stage 6. We recorded them with cameras along the equator that were spaced 6 degrees apart. We computationally increased the resolution so that we had 0.6 degree spacing with view interpolation techniques, and that was enough to run it on all of our video projectors. And the result was that after asking them about 1,000 questions in a row over a course of a week, these folks really donated a great deal of their time and effort to the project, that you could then ask a question of a life-size kind of holographic projection-ish of somebody in front of you, and the natural language technology would play back the most appropriate response we had in the database. And with 1,000 responses, and if you stay on topic, you can actually kind of start to feel like you're having a conversation with someone. So here's our graduate student, Koki Nagano,
How did you survive the Holocaust?
asking a question of Pinchas Guter, how did you survive the Holocaust?
I survived.
And this is just shot entirely in camera.
I believe because Providence watched over me. And also the fact that for a long time,
and it works for multiple people as well. Like here, you know, Koki's got a view and he's standing within the eye line or sitting within the eye line. The camera's getting a different point of view. You can get 6 or 7 people around this pretty effectively. And you know, the thing that we learned from this is that the most important thing that happened when we had this 3-dimensional auto multiscopic image, thanks to Harlan Baker for telling me that it's an auto multiscopic display, not an auto stereoscopic display, was hand gestures. The way that as you're communicating, your hands are actually delineating an area of space, of volume, and using that to communicate, which in 2D video is just totally pressed up against your body. And so that brought this to life just about as much as anything. So that's been done with 12 different subjects. So it's a bit of a bittersweet week because while I'm up here right now, the lab actually, the building that Light Stage 6 has been in, which was Mark Bolas's mixed reality lab, it's actually, they're moving out of that building, and so that means that Light Stage 6 actually has to move out too. So it's actually, as we speak, being disassembled and such, and I think we still might be looking for a good home for it there. We have some takers, but if anyone is thinking that they have a particularly large backyard and don't mind being eccentric or something, I'm actually standing inside Light Stage 3/5, which does have a good home to go to right now, which we stored on top of an office behind it. But it's not all bad news on that. In Beijing, China, we actually just opened last month, I got to see it, a multispectral Light Stage 6. So it's the same 8-meter size. It's got 6-channel LEDs everywhere. It's got a multispectral floor, and they're actually using this for film and television production right now. And there are also many other copies of the face scanning stages that we can see around the world at this point, including at 2 of the most major video game companies that are using it for most of their scans of video game characters. And with the great people that I get to work with at Google, there's another new light stage that we have. And this one is the first one where we can polarize the light, change the color from any direction, and we can actually have either polarization of any color of light in different directions too, which will enable some new techniques. So that is what I brought to talk about today. There's a couple websites down here. There are many, many people to thank as the collaborators and the sponsors, and I'd like to thank the organizers of electronic imaging for putting on such an amazing conference. Thank you very much.